The cafeteria of Station Nexus Prime buzzed with the familiar sounds of 100 different species going about their daily routines. Clicks, chirps, electronic beeps, and the occasional roar mixed together in what most beings had come to accept as the background noise of galactic civilization. The massive space station served as a diplomatic hub, where representatives from across the known galaxy gathered to discuss trade agreements, territorial disputes, and the endless bureaucracy that kept their various worlds functioning together. The farthest corner of the vast dining hall, past the popular tables where the major species congregated, sat a solitary figure that most beings barely noticed anymore. 9 of the Empire occupied a small table designed for singular dining, her elongated form hunched slightly as she picked at what passed for food among her people. The men were known throughout the galaxy as the ghost species, not because they were dead, but because they might as well have been for all the attention anyone paid them. People had made first contact with the Galactic Federation nearly 200 years ago, full of hope and eager to join the vast community of intelligent species that spanned thousands of star systems. Though they had much to offer, they were master engineers, capable of creating technology that seamlessly blended organic and mechanical components in ways that other species found difficult to replicate. Their ships were works of art that could traverse space with efficiency that made even the proud Naval Corps take notice. But the galaxy had little patience for a species that numbered fewer than 50 million across all their worlds. The men were not extinct, but they were close enough to irrelevance that most galactic citizens treated them as such. There had suffered a plague centuries before first contact, not one that killed, but one that had rendered most of their population sterile. They were a dying race, and the galaxy had collectively decided that investing time, resources, or even basic courtesy in the man was simply not worth the effort. Had been serving as a junior diplomatic aide for 3 years now, and in all that time, she could count on her 6-fingered hands how many meaningful conversations she had engaged in with representatives of other species. Most beings looked through her as if she were transparent. When forced to interact with her professionally, they spoke in the clipped, efficient tones reserved for automated systems or furniture that happened to talk back. She understood the logic, even if it stung. Why build relationships with a people who would be gone within a few generations? Why learn their customs, their language nuances, their jokes, when there would be no one left to remember them? The mathematics of politics were cold but clear. Every moment spent on the N was a moment not spent on species that would still matter in 100 years. Today had been particularly difficult. Had spent the morning in a committee hearing about mining rights in the outer spiral, representing her people's modest interests in a small asteroid belt that contained minerals useful for their biomechanical engineering. She had prepared extensive notes, practiced her presentation, and even learned some basic courtesy phrases in the languages of the other committee members. The meeting had lasted exactly 14 minutes. The committee chair, a pompous whose blue-scaled head barely fit through standard doorways, had glanced its proposal with the expression one might reserve for a mildly interesting insect. "The request is noted and filed," he had announced without reading past the first paragraph. "Motion to table indefinitely, all in favor." Every hand, tentacle, and appendage in the room had risen. The motion passed unanimously and had been dismissed with a curt nod that somehow managed to convey both mild irritation and complete indifference. Now she sat alone with her meal, which consisted of a protein paste flavored with minerals that provided the trace elements her people needed to maintain their unique physiology. The paste was nutritious, but bland, much like everything else in her current existence. She watched the social dynamics playing out at the other tables with the detached interest of an anthropologist studying a species she could never truly join. At the central cluster of tables, the delegation held court as always. Their militaristic society produced beings who commanded attention wherever they went, tall, broad-shouldered humanoids whose every movement spoke of disciplined strength. They were discussing fleet movements in the contested border regions, their voices carrying the authority of a people who had never known what it felt like to be ignored. Nearby, the economic powerhouse species were deep in animated conversation about trade routes and profit margins. The K buzzed excitedly as they shared data through their complex pheromone communications, while their allies among the crystalline projected holographic displays of shipping manifests and market projections directly into the air above their table. Even the newer species, those who had achieved space flight within the last century, commanded more respect and attention than the one ever had. The mammalian had quickly established themselves as skilled mediators, their empathic abilities making them valuable in diplomatic negotiations. The plant-like brought unique perspectives on environmental sciences that had revolutionized terraforming techniques across dozens of worlds. Had tried in her first year at the station to approach some of these groups. She had studied their cultures, learned their social customs, and attempted to engage in the casual interactions that seemed to flow so naturally between other species. The results had been uniformly disastrous, not through any hostility or rudeness that would have been easier to bear. Instead, she had been met with polite but distant responses, conversations that died after a few exchanges, and the unmistakable sense that her presence was tolerated rather than welcomed. She had eventually stopped trying. It was less painful to accept isolation than to repeatedly experience the subtle rejections that came with being a representative of a people the galaxy had already written off. As she contemplated the remaining weeks of her assignment and wondered if her replacement would have any better luck building meaningful relationships, noticed a commotion near the main entrance of the cafeteria. A new group was entering, and from the excited whispers spreading through the room, it was clear that something significant was happening. The newcomers were unlike any species had encountered in her xenobiology studies. They appeared to be bipedal mammals, roughly humanoid in shape, but with distinctive features that set them apart from the more familiar races. Their skin tones varied widely across their small group, ranging from pale pinks to rich browns, and their hair came in colors and textures that seemed to follow no pattern could discern. What struck her most immediately was their size. They were considerably smaller than most of the dominant species in the cafeteria, roughly comparable to them in overall mass, but built differently. Where her people were tall and willowy, these beings appeared more compact and sturdy. Their movements carried a sense of barely contained energy that reminded her of some of the predatory species from her, though their faces showed intelligence and curiosity rather than hunting instincts. "Humans," she heard someone whisper at a nearby table, and the word was repeated across the room like a wave spreading through water. Humans had heard rumors about them over the past several months, a new species that had recently achieved faster-than-light travel and made first contact with Federation scouts. The reports had been contradictory and confusing. Some described them as remarkably adaptable generalists who had spread across their entire home system in just a few centuries. Others painted them as a warrior race who seemed to be in a constant state of conflict. Still others suggested they were master engineers, whose technology development had progressed at an unprecedented rate. What everyone seemed to agree on was that the humans were unpredictable. They didn't fit neatly into any of the established categories that galactic civilization used to classify species. They weren't primarily military like the, or purely economic like the K, or diplomatically gifted like the. They seemed to be a little bit of everything, which made other species unsure how to interact with them. As watched, the human delegation paused near the entrance, clearly taking in the overwhelming diversity of species represented in the cafeteria. She could see their eyes moving from table to table, registering the social groupings and hierarchies that governed interactions in this space. Their expressions were fascinating to observe, curiosity mixed with caution, excitement tempered by obvious uncertainty about the protocols and customs they were expected to follow. The delegation appeared to be led by a human female with dark skin and elaborately braided hair that incorporated what looked like small metallic ornaments. She wore clothing that was clearly designed for diplomatic functions, formal enough to show respect, but practical enough to allow for movement. Her companions represented the same diversity in appearance that had noted earlier, and all of them carried themselves with a confidence that suggested they were accustomed to facing new and challenging situations. Found herself genuinely curious about these newcomers for the first time in months. How would they navigate the complex social dynamics of the station? Which groups would they align themselves with? Would they even notice her people's representative sitting alone in the corner, or would they follow the established pattern of gravitating toward the species that mattered in galactic politics? She watched as several of the major delegations began to notice the human presence. The military straightened in his seat, clearly preparing to assess whether these newcomers represented a potential threat or ally. The K Economic Council began buzzing more intensely, their compound eyes focusing on the humans with the calculating gaze they reserved for new market opportunities. Even the normally aloof seemed to be paying attention, their crystalline forms shifting slightly to get a better view of the delegation. The human leader scanned the room once more, her gaze methodical and thorough. For a moment her eyes passed over his corner table and felt the familiar pang of disappointment as the gaze continued moving without pausing. Just another species learning to look past than representative, she thought bitterly. But then something unexpected happened. The human's eyes completed their circuit of the room and came back to his table. This time, the gaze lingered. The human tilted her head slightly, as if considering something, and then said a few quiet words to her companions. Felt her pulse quicken as the human delegation began moving through the cafeteria. For a moment, she thought they might be heading toward her table, but logic reasserted itself quickly. They were probably just looking for an empty table nearby, or perhaps they needed to speak with someone at one of the other tables in her section. The humans moved with purpose through the maze of tables, nodding politely to various beings they passed, but not stopping to engage in conversation. Several delegations watched them hopefully, clearly preparing to extend invitations for the newcomers to join their discussions. The mediators were practically vibrating with eagerness to make first contact, while they had arranged themselves in positions that would allow for easy approach. All of which made it even more shocking when the human leader stopped directly in front of his table. "Excuse me," the human said, and was surprised by the richness and warmth of her voice. She spoke in perfect standard galactic, though with an accent that couldn't immediately identify. "Would you mind if my delegation and I joined you? I'm Ambassador Sarah, representing the United Earth Authority." Stared at the human for several seconds, certain that she had misunderstood. "I'm sorry," she finally managed, "but are you speaking to me?" Ambassador's expression shifted to one of gentle confusion. "Of course I'm speaking to you. You're sitting alone, and we're new here. It seems like a natural pairing unless you'd prefer to maintain your privacy." "No, no," said quickly, gesturing to the empty chairs around her table. "Please sit, I wasn't expecting. That is, most beings prefer to." She trailed off, realizing that any attempt to explain would sound pathetic. "Most beings prefer to what?" Ambassador asked as she took a seat across from. Her companions followed suit, arranging themselves around the table with the easy familiarity of people who had worked together for a long time. "Nothing," said softly. "Please make yourselves comfortable. I'm Nine, representing the Empire." "It's a pleasure to meet you, Nine," Ambassador said, and her tone carried a sincerity that hadn't heard directed at her in months. "I have to admit, we're somewhat overwhelmed by all of this. It's our first time on a Federation station, and the diversity is incredible." One of Ambassador's companions, a tall human with pale skin and reddish hair, leaned forward with obvious interest. "We've been studying Federation species profiles for months, but experiencing it firsthand is completely different. The social dynamics alone are fascinating from an anthropological perspective." Found herself relaxing slightly. "It can be overwhelming," she agreed. "I've been here for 3 years, and I'm still learning new things about how different species interact." 3 years? Another human, this one with medium brown skin and close-cropped dark hair, whistled softly. "That's impressive. You must have incredible insights into how this place really works." The comment sent a flutter of unexpected warmth through his chest. When was the last time someone had suggested that her experience might be valuable? "I'm not sure about incredible insights," she said carefully, "but I've observed quite a bit." Ambassador leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "We were briefed on some of the major players before we arrived, but I have a feeling the real dynamics are more complex than what shows up in official reports." Glanced around the cafeteria, noting that their table had become the focus of considerable attention. She could see beings at other tables leaning toward each other, clearly speculating about why the new human delegation had chosen to sit with the representative. The looks ranged from puzzlement to disapproval, with a few expressions that suggested some beings found the choice amusing. "You should know," said quietly, "that associating with me probably isn't the best way to make a good first impression with the other delegations." Ambassador followed his gaze around the room, taking in the stares and whispered conversations. When she turned back to, her expression was one of genuine curiosity rather than concern. "Why do you say that?" she asked. The question was so direct, so free of the diplomatic doublespeak that usually characterized conversations in this place, that found herself answering honestly. "Because my people are dying," she said simply. We're a small population, declining every year and will probably be extinct within a few generations. The galaxy has decided that we're not worth the investment of time or resources. Most beings here treat me politely when they have to, but they don't see the point in building relationships with someone whose people won't exist much longer. She expected to see the familiar shift in expression that usually followed such explanations, the subtle withdrawal. The calculation of whether continued interaction was worthwhile, the polite but distant smile that preceded a graceful exit from the conversation. Instead, Ambassador's expression grew more thoughtful. "That's terrible," she said, and there was genuine sympathy in her voice. "I can't imagine how isolating that must be." "It's not so bad," said automatically, the lie coming easily after years of practice. "Yes, it is," said the reddish-haired human firmly. "It is that bad, and pretending otherwise doesn't make it easier to bear." Looked at him in surprise. "I'm sorry." "What Dr. Williams means," Ambassador said with a slight smile, "is that humans have some experience with being written off by others. We've found that acknowledging the difficulty usually works better than pretending it doesn't exist." "Written off?" asked. "But you're new to the galaxy, how could you have been written off?" The humans exchanged glances and caught something in their expressions, a shared understanding born of common experience. "On our," Ambassador explained, "humanity has a long history of different groups deciding that other groups weren't worth caring about. We've learned that isolation is one of the things you can do to a social species." Felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of tension she hadn't realized she was carrying. Most species here don't seem to consider isolation particularly cruel. "Then most species here haven't been paying attention to their own histories," Dr. Williams said dryly. "Social exclusion is a devastating weapon precisely because it's so effective at breaking down an individual's sense of worth and belonging." The conversation was unlike anything had experienced during her time on the station. These humans were not just being polite. They were engaging with her as if her thoughts and experiences had genuine value. More than that, they seemed to understand something about her situation that other species had never grasped. "Can I ask you something?" said, then continued without waiting for an answer. "Why did you choose to sit with me? There are dozens of other delegations here, many of them much more important than mine." Ambassador considered the question seriously. "Several reasons," she said finally. "First, you were alone, and no one should have to eat alone if they don't want to. Second, we're new here and could use guidance from someone who understands how things work. Third, we've learned that the people sitting alone in corners often have the most interesting perspectives. And fourth," added the third human, who had been mostly quiet until now, "we don't really care about importance as other species define it. We're more interested in finding people we actually want to talk to." Stared at them, trying to process this completely novel approach to galactic diplomacy. "That's not how things usually work here." "Then maybe it's time for things to work differently," Ambassador said with a smile that was both warm and slightly mischievous. As if summoned by her words, a new presence approached their table. Looked up to see commander of the delegation looming over them, his massive frame casting a shadow across their small gathering. "Ambassador," the commander said in his deep, rumbling voice, "I am commander of the Naval Corps. My delegation would be honored to extend an invitation for you and your people to join our discussion of military cooperation and security protocols." Ambassador looked up at the imposing figure politely. "Thank you for the invitation, Commander. That's very kind of you." Commander waited for a moment, clearly expecting the humans to rise and follow him to the table. When they remained seated, his expression shifted slightly. "Perhaps I was unclear," he said carefully. "We are prepared to discuss mutual defense agreements and technology sharing opportunities." "I understood perfectly," Ambassador replied with the same polite tone. "We appreciate the offer and will certainly want to schedule proper meetings to discuss those topics. Right now, though, we're having a very interesting conversation with our new friend Nine." The silence that followed was profound. Could feel the attention of the entire cafeteria focused on their table as Commander processed the unprecedented response. In her 3 years on the station, she had never seen anyone turn down an opportunity to join a discussion, particularly not in favor of continuing a conversation with Anne. "I see," Commander said finally, his tone carefully neutral. "Perhaps when you have concluded your conversation." You might consider joining a more substantive discussion." The implied dismissal of swarthiness as a conversation partner was clear, and she felt the familiar sting of being reduced to irrelevance. But before she could retreat into her usual defensive silence, Dr. Williams spoke up. "Commander, I'm curious about something," he said with the tone of someone asking about the weather. "In your experience, how often do the most substantive discussions happen at the tables where everyone already agrees with each other?" Commander's expression grew wary. "I'm not certain I understand your meaning." "Well," Dr. Williams continued conversationally, "on our world, we've found that the most valuable insights usually come from perspectives that challenge conventional thinking. Nine here has 3 years of experience observing the social and political dynamics of this station. That strikes me as exactly the kind of substantive perspective we need." Felt her breathing catch. Not only were the humans refusing to abandon her for a more politically advantageous conversation, they were actively defending the value of her perspective to one of the most influential military leaders in the galaxy. Commander looked between the humans and clearly struggling to understand the logic behind their choice. Finally, he gave a stiff nod. "Of course," he said formally, "I'm sure you will find your conversation enlightening. We shall speak later about more pressing matters." As the commander returned to his table, became aware that the background noise of the cafeteria had dropped significantly. Dozens of beings were still watching their table, clearly trying to process what they had just witnessed. "That was," began, then stopped, not sure how to finish the sentence. "Rude of him to interrupt," Ambassador said calmly, picking up her utensil and taking a bite of the meal she had retrieved while Commander was speaking. "Where were we?" Looked at the 3 humans sitting at her table, beings who had known her for less than an hour, but had just publicly declared that conversation with her was more valuable than political negotiations with one of the galaxy's major powers. She felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the warm glow of belonging, of being valued for herself rather than tolerated out of obligation. "We were talking about how things might work differently," she said softly. "Right," Dr. Williams said with a grin. "I have a feeling that's going to be a very long and very interesting discussion." As the noise level in the cafeteria gradually returned to normal, settled back in her chair, and prepared for the first genuine conversation she had enjoyed in longer than she cared to remember. For the first time since arriving at the station, she felt truly curious about what tomorrow might bring. The next morning brought an unusual amount of activity to the diplomatic quarters where maintained her modest office. As the sole and representative on Station Nexus Prime, she was accustomed to days that passed with minimal interruption. Perhaps a few routine communications from her, some paperwork related to minor trade agreements, and the occasional Federation administrative update that applied to all member species regardless of their political significance. Today, however, her communication system had been chiming steadily since early morning. Messages from colleagues on other stations, requests for information from news services, and even a few inquiries from academic institutions studying galactic diplomacy. All of them wanted to know the same thing: what had happened between her and the human delegation, and what did it mean for relations going forward. Stared at her message queue with bewilderment. In 3 years of diplomatic service, she had never received this level of attention. The idea that anyone in the galaxy cared about her professional activities was so foreign that she initially assumed there had been some kind of administrative error. The truth became clear when she accessed the Federation's internal diplomatic network and discovered that yesterday's cafeteria encounter had become the subject of intense speculation throughout the galactic community. Someone had recorded portions of the interaction, and the footage was now circulating among diplomatic circles with the kind of fervor usually reserved for major policy announcements or declarations of war. The recording quality was poor, clearly captured from a distance by someone's personal device, but it was clear enough to show the human delegation choosing to sit with her, their polite but firm rejection of Commander's invitation, and the animated conversation that had continued for nearly 2 hours after the initial encounter. What the recording couldn't convey was the content of that conversation, and that gap was apparently driving the entire diplomatic community to distraction. Door chimed, indicating a visitor. When she opened it, she was surprised to find Ambassador standing in the corridor, looking considerably more formal than she had the previous day. Her diplomatic attire was impeccable, and her expression carried the composed professionalism that recognized as the standard diplomatic mask. "Ambassador," said, stepping aside to allow her entry. "Please come in, though I should warn you that my office is rather modest compared to what you're probably accustomed to." Ambassador entered and glanced around the small space, taking in the simple furnishings and the few personal items that had brought from home. Her expression softened slightly as she noticed a holographic display showing images of an architecture flowing organic structures that seemed to grow from the landscape rather than being imposed upon it. "Your architecture is beautiful," Ambassador observed. "The integration with natural systems is remarkable." "Thank you," said, pleased by the genuine appreciation in the human's voice. "My people have always believed that technology should work with nature rather than against it, though I suppose that philosophy is part of what has made us seem less adaptable to galactic civilization." Ambassador turned from the display with a frown. "How do you mean?" Gestured for her guest to sit in one of the chairs facing her desk. "Most galactic species develop technology that allows them to reshape environments to suit their needs. We develop technology that allows us to fit more harmoniously into existing environments. It's a fundamental difference in approach that has made it difficult for us to compete in the galactic marketplace." "That sounds like an advantage, not a disadvantage," Ambassador said thoughtfully. "Sustainable development is going to become increasingly important as the galaxy's population continues to grow." The comment surprised. Most species viewed engineering as quaint but impractical, beautiful to look at, but unsuited for serious applications. "You really think so?" "I know so," Ambassador said firmly. "Humans have learned the hard way that short-term thinking about resource use leads to long-term problems. We're very interested in technologies that provide sustainable solutions." Felt a flutter of excitement, but years of diplomatic disappointment had taught her to temper her expectations. "That's encouraging to hear, though I should mention that we've had difficulty finding other species willing to invest the time necessary to understand our approaches." "Their loss," Ambassador said with a slight smile. "But that's actually related to why I'm here. I wanted to discuss yesterday's conversation and what it might mean going forward." His excitement faded, replaced by familiar wariness. "I see. Are you concerned about the political implications of your delegation's choice to sit with me?" Ambassador looked genuinely puzzled. "Political implications?" "Commander's offer represented a significant opportunity for your people," explained carefully. "They are one of the most influential military powers in the galaxy. Choosing to continue our conversation instead of accepting their invitation will have been noticed by every delegation on this station." "I'm sure it was," Ambassador agreed. "I'm just not clear on why that should concern us." The response was so unexpected that found herself staring at the human ambassador. "Because you're new to galactic politics," she said slowly. "Your people need to establish relationships with the species that matter. Don't matter. Associating with us too closely could impact how other species perceive your potential value as allies." Ambassador was quiet for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. When she spoke again, her voice carried an edge that hadn't heard the day before. "Can I share something with you about human history?" "Of course." "For most of our species' existence, we've had groups of humans deciding that other groups of humans didn't matter. Sometimes it was based on skin color, sometimes on geographic origin, sometimes on religious beliefs, sometimes on economic status. The specifics varied, but the pattern was always the same: create artificial hierarchies of worth, then use those hierarchies to justify treating some people as less deserving of consideration." Ambassador leaned forward in her chair. "We've learned that species who participate in these systems of artificial hierarchy are usually not the kind of species we want as allies. If the or any other group judges our worth based on who we choose to associate with, then they're not people we're interested in working with anyway." Absorbed this perspective, trying to reconcile it with everything she understood about how galactic politics functioned. "That's a very principled position," she said carefully, "but principles can be expensive in diplomatic terms." "So can abandoning them," Ambassador replied. "Tell me something in your 3 years here. How many meaningful agreements has the delegation been able to negotiate?" The question hit closer to home than was comfortable with. "Very few," she admitted. "Most species prefer to work directly with each other rather than including us in multilateral agreements." And how has accepting that treatment worked out for your people? Was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. Not well, she said finally. We've become increasingly marginalized and our economic situation continues to deteriorate. So the traditional approach isn't actually working, Ambassador said gently. Maybe it's time to try something different. Before could respond, her communication system chimed again. She glanced at the display and saw an incoming priority message from Ambassador Ox of the Mediation Council. They were known throughout the galaxy for their empathic abilities and their skill at facilitating diplomatic negotiations. A message from their senior ambassador was unprecedented. I should probably take this, said apologetically. Ambassador nodded, of course. Activated the communication, and Ambassador Ox's image appeared in holographic form above her desk. There was a graceful being whose mammalian features were softened by the subtle luminescence that indicated active empathic scanning. 9 of the N, Ambassador Ox said in the musical tones characteristic of her species. I hope I am not intruding at an inconvenient time. Not at all, Ambassador Ox. How may I assist you? The large eyes shifted to take an ambassador's presence. Ah, Ambassador, how fortuitous. I was hoping to speak with you both about a matter of some importance to the diplomatic community. Exchanged glances with Ambassador, who gestured for her to continue the conversation. Please go ahead, said. As I'm sure you're both aware, yesterday's interaction in the central cafeteria has generated considerable interest among the various delegations. Many of my colleagues are curious about the nature of your discussion and what it might indicate about future human diplomatic priorities. Ambassador spoke up. With respect, Ambassador Ox, I'm not sure why our choice of lunch companions should be a matter of galactic concern. Ambassador Ox's expression grew more serious. Because, Ambassador, the human approach to relations appears to be significantly different from established norms. This has created uncertainty among species who are trying to understand how to engage with your people effectively. I see, Ambassador said carefully. And what kind of uncertainty are we talking about? Well, Ambassador Ox continued, there are those who believe that your delegation's choice to prioritize social conversation with a representative of a declining species over strategic discussions with established powers indicates either naivety about galactic politics or a deliberate rejection of existing diplomatic frameworks. Felt her stomach drop. She had known that associating with her would create complications for the humans, but hearing it stated so directly was painful. And what do you believe? Ambassador asked, her tone remaining neutral. I believe, Ambassador Ox said thoughtfully, that humans may be operating from a fundamentally different set of values than most galactic species. This could be either very beneficial or very disruptive, depending on how it manifests in practice. Ambassador leaned back in her chair. Ambassador Ox, may I ask you a direct question? Certainly. In your experience as a mediator, how often do the existing diplomatic frameworks actually solve problems versus simply managing them? The question clearly caught the off guard. Her empathic luminescence flickered as she processed the implications of the inquiry. That is a complex question, she said carefully. But an important one, Ambassador pressed. Because from our preliminary observations, it seems like the current system is very good at maintaining the status, but not particularly effective at addressing underlying issues. Ambassador Ox was quiet for several seconds. You are suggesting that the current diplomatic framework is inadequate. I'm suggesting that any system that systematically excludes perspectives based on arbitrary measures of worth is probably missing important information, Ambassador said. 9 has 3 years of detailed observation of how this station functions. That's valuable intelligence regardless of her people's population size. Stared at Ambassador, hardly able to believe that someone was defending her value to one of the galaxy's most respected mediators. That is an interesting perspective, Ambassador Ox said slowly. Though I should point out that population size is not considered arbitrary by most galactic species. Species with larger populations have greater resources to contribute to collective efforts. Do they? Ambassador asked. Or do they just have greater ability to impose their will on smaller groups? The challenge was direct enough that Ambassador Ox's empathic scanning intensified noticeably. Ambassador, Are you suggesting that the galactic community is structured around coercion rather than cooperation? I'm suggesting that any system that measures worth primarily by size and power is going to have inherent biases that prevent it from accessing the full range of available solutions to problems. Watched this exchange with fascination. She had never seen anyone challenge fundamental assumptions about galactic politics so directly, particularly not to a senior mediator. Ambassador Ox turned her attention to 9. What is your perspective on this discussion? The question put in a difficult position. She could provide the diplomatic response that would avoid controversy, or she could speak honestly about her experiences. The presence of Ambassador, who had already shown remarkable courage in defending her value, tipped the balance toward honesty. Ambassador Ox said carefully, I have spent 3 years observing the diplomatic processes on this station. In that time, I have seen the same problems arise repeatedly, with the same solutions proposed by the same species, leading to the same inadequate results. Such as, took a deep breath, the resource conflicts in the outer spiral, for instance. Every few months, there's a new dispute between mining operations and environmental preservation efforts. The solution is always the same: divide the territory and hope the problems don't spread. But they always do spread, because the underlying issue is that most galactic species approach resource extraction as a zero-sum game. And you believe that an approach would be different? Ambassador Ox asked. I believe our approach might offer alternatives that haven't been considered, said. Our biomechanical engineering allows for resource extraction that actually improves environmental stability rather than degrading it. But no one has ever asked us to participate in those discussions because our contribution is seen as insignificant. Ambassador smiled. That's exactly what I'm talking about. How many other valuable perspectives are being excluded because they don't come from major powers? Ambassador Ox's empathic luminescence had grown more intense as the conversation progressed. This is thought-provoking, she admitted, though I should point out that changing established diplomatic frameworks would require consensus among the major species. Would it? Ambassador asked. Or would it just require some species being willing to work outside those frameworks when necessary? The implications of the question hung in the air between them. Realized that they were discussing nothing less than a fundamental challenge to the way galactic civilization organized itself. Ambassador Ox spoke carefully. Ambassador, are you suggesting that the human delegation intends to operate outside established diplomatic channels? I'm suggesting that we intend to work with anyone whose perspectives we find valuable, regardless of their official status within existing power structures, Ambassador replied. If that means working outside established channels sometimes, then that's what we'll do. That could be seen as disruptive to galactic stability. So could ignoring good ideas because they come from the wrong sources, Ambassador countered. Found herself holding her breath as she watched this exchange. 2 senior diplomats were essentially debating whether to maintain the system that had marginalized her people or to challenge it directly. Ambassador Ox was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her tone was more thoughtful than cautious. Ambassador, if the human delegation were to pursue this approach, what would you see as the first steps? Ambassador glanced at before responding. I think the first step would be to identify species whose perspectives have been undervalued and create opportunities for those perspectives to be heard. After that, we'd work on building coalitions around specific issues rather than general political alignments. That would certainly be innovative, Ambassador Ox said carefully. It would also be effective, said quietly, surprising herself by speaking up. There are several species on this station whose expertise could solve problems, but they're never included in the relevant discussions. Ambassador Ox turned her empathic focus on. You have specific examples in mind. Nodded. The collective has developed remarkable techniques for ecosystem restoration, but they're excluded from environmental discussions because there was never considered economically important. They have mathematical models for resource distribution that could eliminate most territorial conflicts, but their population is too small for their proposals to be taken seriously. And the N have sustainable engineering solutions that could revolutionize how the galaxy approaches resource extraction, Ambassador added. Ambassador Ox absorbed this information, her empathic scanning continuing throughout the exchange. "This is a compelling argument," she said finally, though implementing such an approach would face significant opposition from established interests. "Probably," Ambassador agreed, "but that doesn't make it wrong." The mediator was quiet for several more seconds. "I would like to continue this discussion at greater length," she said eventually. "Perhaps we could arrange a more formal meeting to explore these ideas further." Felt a surge of excitement that she tried to keep from showing on her face. A formal meeting with Ambassador Ox was an unprecedented opportunity for the UN delegation. "We'd be happy to arrange something," Ambassador said, "though I think any such discussion should include representatives from all the species we've mentioned." Ambassador Ox's eyes widened slightly. "A multi-species working group." "Why not?" Ambassador asked. "If we're serious about accessing undervalued perspectives, then we should hear from multiple species who've been excluded from relevant discussions." "That would be highly unusual." "Good," Ambassador said with a smile. "Usual hasn't been working very well." After Ambassador Ox ended the communication, sat in stunned silence for several minutes. In the span of a single conversation, she had gone from being an ignored observer to being a potential participant in reshaping galactic diplomatic approaches. "Are you really serious about this?" she asked Ambassador finally. "Completely serious," Ambassador replied. "The current system is inefficient and exclusionary. It's time for something better." "But the resistance you'll face will be significant," Ambassador acknowledged. "But change is rarely easy, and it's never accomplished by those who are comfortable with the status." Looked at the human ambassador with a mixture of admiration and concern. "You could have played it safe. Your people could have integrated into existing power structures and built comfortable alliances with established species. Why risk all that for ideas that might not work?" Ambassador smiled. "Because comfortable alliances with established species wouldn't actually serve humanity's long-term interests. We're looking for partners who can help us solve problems, not people who can help us maintain systems that don't work." "And you think the UN can be that kind of partner?" "I think the UN have been that kind of partner all along," Ambassador said. "They've just been waiting for someone to notice." As contemplated this perspective, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years' hope for her people's future in galactic civilization. For the first time since accepting her diplomatic assignment, she began to believe that the UN might have more to offer the galaxy than anyone had previously imagined. The meeting chamber that Ambassador Ox had reserved for their unprecedented multi-species working group was larger than any room had ever been invited to use for official and business. Located in the diplomatic sector's premium conference area, it featured advanced holographic projection systems, real-time translation capabilities for over 300 galactic languages, and seating arrangements that could be configured for the physiological needs of nearly any known species. As entered the chamber, she was struck by the sight of beings she had observed from afar for years, but never imagined she would work alongside. The collective representative appeared as a graceful cluster of interconnected plant-like entities whose individual components moved in perfect harmony while maintaining distinct personalities. Their communication involved subtle shifts in coloration and chemical emissions that the translation system converted into spoken language. The mathematician was a crystalline being whose geometric form seemed to exist in more dimensions than its visual system could properly process. When they communicated, mathematical equations and probability matrices appeared in the air around them, creating a dazzling display of pure logic made visible. Also present was Doctor of the Whispering Void Coalition, a species so rarely seen in diplomatic circles that had to access her cultural database to understand their basic biology. The Whispering Void dwellers existed primarily in the vast empty spaces between star systems, their technology so different from conventional galactic civilization that most species found it impossible to comprehend. Doctor appeared as a shifting pattern of energy contained within a specially designed environmental suit that allowed them to exist in atmosphere-based environments. Ambassador and Dr. Williams represented the human delegation, while Ambassador Ox served as the session facilitator. The presence of such respected mediator lent the gathering a legitimacy that none of the other species could have achieved on their own. "Before we begin formal discussions," Ambassador Ox announced, I want to acknowledge that this gathering represents something genuinely unprecedented in galactic diplomacy. We have assembled representatives of species whose perspectives have historically been marginalized or excluded from major policy discussions, with the goal of exploring alternative approaches to persistent challenges. The collective spokesperson, who had introduced themselves as Harmony of Growing Solutions, shifted to a deeper green coloration that the translation system indicated was equivalent to serious attention. We must express our appreciation for this opportunity. They have developed ecological restoration techniques that could address environmental degradation across hundreds of worlds, but we have never been invited to share this knowledge in formal diplomatic settings. Doctor's energy pattern fluctuated in what appeared to be agreement. The Void Coalition has observed galactic civilization's development with great interest, but our offers of technological cooperation have been dismissed as incomprehensible. We possess methods for energy generation and spatial manipulation that could revolutionize galactic infrastructure, but few species have shown willingness to invest the time necessary to understand our approaches. The mathematician, who went by the designation Prime Equation 7, projected a complex three-dimensional graph into the center of the room. Our statistical models indicate that current galactic resource allocation protocols operate at approximately 37% efficiency. We have developed distribution algorithms that could improve this figure to 91% efficiency while reducing territorial conflicts by 84%. These models have been available for 63 years, but have never been implemented due to their origin from a species classified as economically insignificant. Listen to these presentations with growing amazement. Each species represented capabilities that could address major galactic challenges, yet all of them had been systematically excluded from relevant discussions. The scope of the missed opportunities was staggering. "This is exactly what we hoped to discover," Dr. Williams said, making notes on his portable data pad. "From an anthropological perspective, we're looking at a systematic failure to access available solutions due to arbitrary classification systems." Ambassador Ox leaned forward with interest. "Dr. Williams, can you elaborate on what you mean by arbitrary classification systems?" "Certainly," Dr. Williams replied, activating his own holographic display. "Galactic civilization appears to use economic and military power as primary indicators of potential contribution to problem-solving efforts. However, our analysis suggests that these metrics have little correlation with actual innovative capacity or specialized knowledge." He gestured to the assembled representatives. "Each species here possesses expertise that directly addresses major galactic challenges, yet they've been excluded from relevant discussions because they don't meet conventional measures of importance. This suggests that the classification system itself is the primary obstacle to effective problem-solving." Prime Equation 7 projected a new set of calculations. Statistical analysis confirms Dr. Williams' hypothesis. Current diplomatic inclusion protocols show negative correlation with solution effectiveness across multiple problem categories. Harmony of Growing Solutions shifted to a pattern of blue and silver that indicated curiosity. Are the humans suggesting that galactic civilization has been systematically ignoring its most valuable problem-solving resources? "That's exactly what we're suggesting," Ambassador confirmed, "and we think it's time to change that approach." Ambassador Ox had been monitoring the emotional resonance of the conversation through her empathic abilities, and noticed that the mediator's luminescence had grown steadily brighter as the discussion progressed. "The potential implications of this perspective are significant," she said carefully. "If even a fraction of these capabilities could be properly integrated into galactic problem-solving efforts, it could fundamentally alter our approach to persistent challenges." "That's the goal," Ambassador said. "But implementation will require more than just good intentions. We need to demonstrate that alternative approaches can produce superior results." Doctor's energy pattern fluctuated rapidly. "The Void Coalition would welcome opportunities to demonstrate our capabilities through practical applications. Our spatial manipulation technologies could solve the transportation bottlenecks that limit trade in the Outer Rim territories. They could address the ecological degradation on mining worlds that has been declared irreversible by conventional methods," Harmony of Growing Solutions added. "And the resource distribution models could eliminate the territorial disputes that consume vast amounts of diplomatic resources every year," Prime Equation 7 contributed. felt a surge of excitement as she realized the scope of what they were discussing. Then biomechanical engineering could revolutionize resource extraction to make it sustainable rather than depleting. We've been trying to share this technology for decades, but no one has been interested in approaches that don't maximize short-term yields. Ambassador Ox absorbed all of this information, her empathic scanning intensifying. What you're describing amounts to a comprehensive alternative to current galactic approaches across multiple domains. The potential benefits are extraordinary, but so are the political obstacles. Which brings us to the practical question, Dr. Williams said. How do we move from theory to implementation? Ambassador activated her own display, showing a star chart of the local galactic region. We've identified several ongoing challenges that haven't been resolved through conventional diplomatic channels. If we can demonstrate superior results using the approaches represented in this room, it will establish precedent for expanded cooperation. She highlighted several systems on the chart. The 442 mining dispute has been ongoing for 18 months with no resolution. The environmental degradation on 7 has been declared irreversible by Federation scientists. The resource allocation crisis in the Vega colony cluster continues to generate conflicts despite multiple mediation attempts. Each of these situations represents a failure of current approaches, Dr. Williams added. They're perfect candidates for demonstrating alternative solutions. Prime Equation 7 projected probability calculations around each of the highlighted systems. Mathematical analysis indicates high success probability for proposed alternative approaches across all 3 scenarios. Conventional solution probability remains below 15% for all cases. Ambassador Ox studied the data with obvious interest. The mathematics are compelling, but pursuing these initiatives would require operating outside established diplomatic channels. That could generate significant opposition from conventional power structures. Probably, Ambassador acknowledged. But the alternative is continuing to accept inadequate results from systems that aren't working. Doctor's energy pattern shifted to what the translation system indicated was excitement. The Void Coalition has long observed that galactic civilization's attachment to conventional approaches prevents it from accessing superior solutions. We would welcome the opportunity to demonstrate practical alternatives. Harmony of Growing Solutions cycled through several color patterns before settling on one that indicated determination. The belief that living systems flourish when they embrace diversity rather than conformity. If galactic civilization could learn to value diverse approaches to problem-solving, it would become stronger and more resilient. Found herself speaking before she had consciously decided to contribute. The men have always believed that the best solutions emerge when different perspectives are allowed to combine and interact. Our biomechanical engineering succeeds precisely because it integrates approaches that other species consider incompatible. Ambassador Ox was quiet for several minutes, clearly processing the emotional and practical implications of what was being proposed. When she spoke again, her tone carried a decisiveness that surprised everyone in the room. I believe, she said carefully, that the Mediation Council would be interested in facilitating pilot programs to test these alternative approaches. Our empathic abilities allow us to assess the emotional resonance of potential solutions, and what I'm sensing from this group is genuinely unprecedented. Ambassador leaned forward with interest. What kind of pilot programs are you thinking about? Small-scale interventions in the situations you've identified, Ambassador Ox replied. If we can demonstrate superior results without disrupting major diplomatic initiatives, it would provide evidence for the value of expanded cooperation. Dr. Williams nodded enthusiastically. That's perfect from a research perspective. We'd have controlled conditions for comparing conventional and alternative approaches. Prime Equation 7 projected new calculations. Statistical models indicate optimal implementation strategy involves parallel development of solutions for all 3 identified scenarios. Success in multiple domains simultaneously would maximize impact on galactic policy considerations. The logistics would be complex, Ambassador observed, but manageable if we coordinate properly. Doctor's energy pattern fluctuated rapidly. The Void Coalition possesses transportation capabilities that could facilitate coordination across multiple star systems without relying on conventional galactic infrastructure. Harmony of growing solutions shifted to a pattern indicating agreement. The collective consciousness allows for real-time communication across vast distances. We could provide coordination capabilities that conventional diplomatic channels cannot match. Felt a growing sense of excitement as she realized that they were moving beyond theoretical discussions toward practical planning. Then biomechanical engineering workshops could produce specialized equipment for each scenario within standard time frames, assuming we have access to appropriate raw materials. Ambassador Ox's empathic luminescence had reached levels that had never seen in a diplomatic setting. The emotional resonance from this group is extraordinary, she said with obvious amazement. I'm detecting genuine collaboration rather than competitive positioning. This is refreshing. That's the difference between working toward shared goals versus competing for limited resources, Ambassador observed. When everyone brings unique capabilities to address different aspects of complex problems, collaboration becomes more valuable than competition. Which brings us back to the fundamental issue, Dr. Williams added. Galactic civilization's current structure encourages competition even in situations where collaboration would be more effective. Ambassador Ox nodded thoughtfully. They have long observed this dynamic, but we've focused on managing its negative effects rather than addressing its underlying causes. Maybe it's time to address the causes, Ambassador suggested. Prime Equation 7 projected a new set of calculations. Mathematical analysis indicates that systematic collaboration among the species represented in this room could generate solution effectiveness improvements of several orders of magnitude compared to conventional approaches. The implications hung in the air as everyone absorbed what was being proposed. They were discussing nothing less than demonstrating that galactic civilization's fundamental assumptions about problem-solving were incorrect. The political resistance will be enormous, Ambassador Ox warned. Many species have significant investments in maintaining current power structures. Then we'll have to make sure our results are so obviously superior that the political resistance becomes irrelevant, Ambassador replied. Doctor's energy pattern shifted to what appeared to be amusement. The Void Coalition has little concern for conventional political structures. We exist in the spaces between established civilization, which provides excellent perspective on its limitations. Harmony of growing solutions cycled through several colors before settling on one that indicated resolve. They have waited centuries for opportunities to contribute our capabilities to galactic well-being. We will not allow political considerations to prevent us from pursuing this chance. Looked around the room at beings she had never imagined working with, planning initiatives that could fundamentally change her people's place in galactic civilization. Are we really going to try this? She asked. We're going to do more than try, Ambassador said with a smile that somehow managed to be both confident and mischievous. We're going to succeed. As the meeting progressed into detailed planning for their unprecedented collaborative initiative, felt something she had never experienced before, the genuine excitement of being part of something important. For the first time in her diplomatic career, she was looking forward to tomorrow. 6 weeks after their initial meeting, found herself standing on the observation deck of a Void Coalition transport vessel, watching 3 different star systems simultaneously through spatial manipulation technology that conventional galactic science insisted was impossible. Doctor had explained that their ships existed partially outside normal space-time, allowing them to maintain presence in multiple locations while traveling between them at speeds that made conventional faster-than-light travel look sluggish. The view was disorienting but magnificent. Through one section of the transparent barrier, she could see the mining operation on 442B, where Prime Equation 7 was implementing resource distribution protocols that had already reduced territorial conflicts by 60%. Through another section, Harmony of Growing Solutions was directing the restoration of 7's devastated ecosystem, using techniques that were regenerating soil and atmosphere at rates that had stunned Federation scientists. The third view showed her own biomechanical extraction systems operating on 3 worlds in the Vega colony cluster, producing higher yields while actually improving environmental stability. The results are exceeding even our most optimistic projections, Dr. Williams said, joining her at the observation deck. The human anthropologist had become something of a coordination specialist for their coalition, using his analytical skills to track the complex interactions between different species approaches. "It's incredible," replied, still hardly able to believe what she was seeing. "6 weeks ago, I thought my people's best hope was to maintain our current minimal status in galactic affairs. Now we're leading environmental restoration efforts that could change how the entire galaxy approaches resource management." Dr. Williams consulted his data pad, which displayed streams of information flowing from all 3 active projects. The political implications are becoming impossible to ignore. Word is spreading through diplomatic channels about the success rates we're achieving. As if summoned by his words, Ambassador materialized beside them using the Void Coalition's teleportation technology. Even after weeks of working with Doctor's people, still found their spatial manipulation capabilities unsettling. "We have a situation developing," Ambassador announced without preamble. "Ambassador Ox just contacted me from Nexus Prime. Representatives from 12 major species are demanding an emergency council session to address what they're calling unauthorized diplomatic initiatives disrupting established protocols." Felt her stomach drop. "How bad is it?" "Significant," Ambassador replied honestly. "They are claiming that our resource distribution work in the Vega cluster violates existing territorial agreements. The K Economic Council is arguing that our efficiency improvements constitute unfair trade advantages. Even some of the moderate species are expressing concerns about precedent and regulatory oversight." Dr. Williams frowned at his data pad. "Have they cited specific violations of Federation law?" "That's the interesting part," Ambassador said. "They haven't, because technically we haven't broken any laws. All of our work has been conducted at the invitation of local governments or through existing Federation disaster relief protocols. But we've definitely disrupted the conventional power balance." Doctor's energy signature appeared beside them, their form stabilizing into the familiar containment suit configuration. "The Void Coalition has monitored communication traffic regarding your coalition's activities. Opposition forces are organizing systematic resistance campaign." "What kind of resistance?" asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Economic pressure on participating governments, diplomatic isolation threats, military positioning in affected systems," Doctor replied. "Standard techniques for discouraging deviation from established power structures." Ambassador was quiet for a moment, clearly considering their options. "How are the local governments responding?" "Mixed reactions," Dr. Williams said, consulting his data. "The 442 Mining Consortium is publicly supporting Prime Equation 7's work because it's eliminated their territorial disputes while increasing overall yields. The 7 colonial government has declared Harmony of Growing Solutions restoration work essential to their survival." "And the Vega colonies?" asked. "They're requesting permanent implementation of biomechanical systems across all their extraction operations," Dr. Williams replied with a smile. "Apparently, the combination of higher yields and environmental improvement is exactly what they needed to achieve economic sustainability." Doctor's energy pattern in what had learned to recognize as satisfaction. "Local success creates pressure for broader implementation. Opposition forces understand this dynamic." "Which means they'll escalate their resistance," Ambassador said grimly. "The question is whether we're prepared for that escalation." Before anyone could respond, the space around them shimmered and Harmony of Growing Solutions materialized using transportation techniques that involved temporarily merging with the quantum substrate of space itself. Their color patterns indicated urgency mixed with excitement. "Forgive the intrusion," they said, "but developments on 7 require immediate coalition attention." "Problems with the restoration work?" asked. "The opposite," Harmony of Growing Solutions replied, shifting to patterns that indicated wonder. "The ecosystem restoration has proceeded so successfully that indigenous life forms previously thought extinct have begun to reappear. The planetary government has requested expansion of techniques to their entire continental system." Dr. Williams whistled softly. "That's a complete planetary restoration project. The implications for Federation environmental policy would be enormous." The Federation Environmental Council has already requested formal evaluation of restoration techniques for inclusion in standard planetary recovery protocols. Harmony of Growing Solutions continued. This represents recognition at the highest levels of galactic government. Ambassador absorbed this information with obvious satisfaction. So we have concrete success stories generating official interest from Federation agencies, while traditional power structures are organizing resistance. Prime Equation 7's crystalline form appeared among them, using transportation methods that still didn't pretend to understand. Mathematical displays immediately surrounded them, showing probability matrices and statistical analyses. Current situation represents classic tipping point scenario, they announced. Success probability for coalition approaches now exceeds 87% if implementation continues. Opposition success probability decreases exponentially with each additional demonstrated result. But their resistance will be most intense right now, Dr. Williams observed, before our success becomes undeniable. Precisely, Prime Equation 7 confirmed. Next 14 standard days represent critical decision period. Coalition must either achieve breakthrough sufficient to overcome opposition pressure or face systematic dismantling of collaborative efforts. Ambassador turned to Doctor. What kind of resources can the Void Coalition commit to protecting our operations? Doctor's energy pattern grew more complex. Void Coalition possesses defensive capabilities that conventional galactic military forces cannot counter. However, direct confrontation would validate opposition claims about destabilizing influences. Then we need to win through superior results rather than superior force, Ambassador concluded. Had been listening to this exchange with growing certainty about what needed to happen next. I think we need to accelerate our timeline, she said. Everyone turned to her with surprise. As the youngest and least experienced diplomat in their coalition, she rarely took the lead in strategic discussions. Explain, Ambassador said encouragingly. Right now, we're working on 3 separate projects that demonstrate our capabilities individually, said. But the opposition is treating them as isolated incidents that can be contained. What if we could demonstrate integrated collaboration on a scale that makes containment impossible? Harmony of Growing Solutions shifted to colors indicating interest. They are curious about the implications of this suggestion. There's a situation that's been developing in the system, continued. Complete ecological collapse on the primary agricultural world, resource conflicts across 4 mining operations, and transportation bottlenecks that are preventing effective relief efforts. The Federation has declared it an unsolvable crisis requiring population evacuation. Prime Equation 7 projected probability calculations around the scenario had described. Mathematical analysis indicates extraordinary complexity requiring simultaneous application of multiple specialized approaches. Exactly, said with growing excitement. It's too complex for any single species to solve using conventional methods, but if our coalition could coordinate all our capabilities to address different aspects simultaneously. Dr. Williams was accessing files on his data pad. The crisis involves over 40 million beings across 6 worlds. If we could resolve something that large and complex, it would demonstrate capabilities that the galaxy couldn't ignore. Doctor's energy pattern fluctuated rapidly. Void Coalition transportation and logistics capabilities would be essential for coordinating multi-world intervention. The collective consciousness could provide real-time coordination across the entire system, Harmony of Growing Solutions added. Mathematical models could optimize resource distribution and logistics across all planetary operations, Prime Equation 7 contributed. And in biomechanical engineering could simultaneously address extraction efficiency and environmental restoration, finished. Ambassador was quiet for several minutes, clearly considering the implications of what they were discussing. It would be an enormous undertaking, she said finally. If we succeeded, it would revolutionize how the galaxy approaches complex crisis management. If we failed, we'd be finished as a coalition, and probably as individual diplomatic entities, Dr. Williams completed the thought. The risks are significant, Ambassador continued, but so is the potential impact. A successful resolution of the crisis using integrated coalition approaches would establish precedent for expanded cooperation on a galactic scale. Prime Equation 7 projected new calculations. Success probability for integrated approach to crisis currently measures 63%. However, probability increases with preparation time and resource allocation. How much preparation time are we talking about? Ambassador asked. Optimal implementation window occurs in approximately 21 standard days, Prime Equation 7 replied. This coincides with opposition forces' expected timeline for political countermeasures. Harmony of growing solutions cycled through several color patterns. They perceive this as the moment when our coalition either establishes itself as a permanent force in galactic affairs or is dismissed as an interesting anomaly. Doctor's energy signature intensified. Void coalition analysis confirms critical decision point. Current trajectory leads either to fundamental change in galactic cooperation models or return to inefficient conventional approaches. Looked around at her coalition partners, beings who had become genuine friends and collaborators over the past weeks. Are we really going to attempt something this ambitious? Ambassador smiled with the expression had learned to associate with humanity's most audacious decisions. 6 weeks ago you were eating lunch alone because the galaxy had decided your people didn't matter. Today, you're proposing to lead the most ambitious crisis intervention in galactic history. I think we've already proven that conventional limitations don't apply to us. The question is whether we're prepared to commit fully to proving it to everyone else, Dr. Williams added. Thought about her people back on the man, struggling with declining population and diminishing resources, while possessing technologies that could help countless other species. She thought about the potential represented by every being in their coalition capabilities that could transform galactic civilization if given the chance to flourish. I think, she said carefully, that we've already committed to proving it. Now we just need to follow through. Prime Equation 7 projected approval calculations, while harmony of growing solutions shifted to colors indicating determination. Doctor's energy patterns stabilized into configurations that suggested complete readiness. Then it's settled, Ambassador announced. We have 21 days to organize the most complex multi-species intervention in galactic history, no pressure at all. As their coalition began detailed planning for what would either be their greatest triumph or their final failure, felt the familiar mixture of excitement and terror that had become her constant companion since the humans had chosen to sit with her. 6 weeks ago, her greatest ambition had been to maintain her people's minimal place in galactic affairs. Now she was helping to plan an operation that could redefine what galactic cooperation looked like. The irony wasn't lost on her that it had all started with someone simply choosing not to leave her alone. The main auditorium of Station Nexus Prime had never hosted a session quite like this one. Emergency council meetings were typically somber affairs dominated by the major galactic powers, with predetermined outcomes and carefully managed presentations. Today, however, the massive chamber buzzed with an energy that Ambassador recognized as the sound of genuine uncertainty. Stood at the central presentation platform, surrounded by holographic displays that showed real-time data from the system. 18 days of intensive coalition work had transformed what the Federation had declared an unsolvable crisis into a remarkable success story that was reshaping everyone's understanding of what cooperative problem-solving could accomplish. The numbers spoke for themselves. The complete ecological collapse on Prime had been reversed using restoration techniques, with indigenous species returning to regions that had been barren wastelands just 3 weeks earlier. Resource conflicts across the system's mining operations had been eliminated through implementation of mathematical distribution models that optimized yields while reducing territorial disputes to zero. The transportation bottlenecks that had prevented effective relief efforts had been solved using Void Coalition spatial manipulation technologies that allowed near-instantaneous movement of personnel and supplies across multiple star systems. Most remarkably, and biomechanical engineering had not only restored sustainable extraction operations across all affected worlds, but had actually improved environmental conditions beyond their pre-crisis baselines. The agricultural output of Prime was now projected to exceed historical levels within 6 months. The results are undeniable, said addressing the assembled representatives of 43 galactic species. What the Federation classified as an unsolvable crisis requiring population evacuation has been resolved through coordinated application of previously marginalized technologies and approaches. She gestured to the holographic displays showing environmental data from across the system. More importantly, these results were achieved through genuine collaboration between species whose capabilities have been systematically undervalued by conventional diplomatic frameworks. From her position in the coalition delegation section, Ambassador watched the reactions around the auditorium with fascination. The mathematical precision of the data was impossible to argue with. The environmental restoration results were visible in real-time satellite feeds, and the economic improvements were already showing up in regional trade statistics. Commander of the delegation was the first to speak, his voice carrying the careful neutrality that indicated significant internal conflict. The results achieved in the system are impressive, he admitted. However, this council must consider the implications of operations conducted outside established diplomatic and regulatory frameworks. Prime Equation 7 materialized beside using transportation technology, their crystalline form projecting mathematical displays throughout the chamber. Statistical analysis indicates that conventional frameworks would have achieved 0% success probability for crisis resolution. Alternative approaches were demonstrably superior. The K economic representative, whose compound eyes had been tracking the financial data streams throughout its presentation, buzzed with obvious frustration. The efficiency improvements documented in these reports represent competitive advantages that disrupt established market equilibriums. Implementation of these technologies without proper regulatory oversight